Ethan Caldwell grabbed his ex-wife's settlement check, tore it in half, and threw the pieces across the kitchen table at her face, then walked out laughing, certain he had won. He had traded her for a woman with 4 million followers and a designer wardrobe. He had called Claire boring, small, and invisible. He had told her to her face that she would never survive without him. 3 years later, Ethan walked into America's most exclusive royal gala and froze. Because the woman descending that grand staircase, commanding a room full of billionaires and senators with a single glance wearing a crown, was Claire, his ex-wife, the one he threw away like paper. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have believed in you, stay until the very end of this story. Subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Ethan Caldwell had a habit that most people around him noticed, but nobody ever said out loud. He kept score. Not the kind of score you keep in a game where the numbers are written on a board and everyone can see them. Ethan kept a private score, a running tally in his head of who had more, who had less, who was rising, and who was falling behind. He kept score with his colleagues at the firm. He kept score with his neighbors in the building. He kept score with strangers at restaurants when he saw what kind of car they drove or what brand of watch sat on their wrist. And for a long time, Ethan believed he was winning. He had the corner office on the 34th floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan, where on clear mornings the sunlight came through the floor-to-ceiling windows and painted everything gold. He had a wardrobe full of suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He had dinner reservations at places where the waiting list stretched 6 weeks long, and he had the kind of confidence that fills a room before a man even opens his mouth. By every measure, Ethan understood he was successful. But success for Ethan was never a destination. It was a mirror, and he spent every day of his adult life polishing it, tilting it at different angles, trying to find the reflection that finally felt like enough. The problem? And it was a problem that would take years, and one devastating evening to fully understand, was that Ethan had never once stopped to look at who was standing beside him in that mirror. Her name was Claire Whitmore Caldwell, and she had been there from the very beginning. They had met 12 years ago at a small fundraiser in Brooklyn, back when Ethan was still a mid-level analyst grinding 60-hour weeks and living in an apartment so small that the kitchen and the living room were essentially the same room. Claire had been volunteering that night, helping to catalog a collection of donated historical letters from the Civil War era. She was crouched behind a folding table, carefully turning the pages of a document with white-gloved hands, completely unbothered by the noise and the crowd around her, and something about the way she was so entirely absorbed in what she was doing made Ethan stop walking. He had been on his way to find the open bar. He never made it. They talked for 3 hours that night. Not about ambition or portfolios or career trajectories. They talked about history, about the way old letters revealed the private fears of people who had been dead for a century, about what it felt like to hold something fragile and irreplaceable, and know that its survival depended entirely on how carefully you handled it. Ethan would not understand until much later that she had been describing their marriage before it even began. They got married 2 years later in a small ceremony in upstate New York. Claire wore her grandmother's pearls. There were 40 guests. The reception dinner cost less than Ethan's current monthly car payment, and in those early years, they were genuinely happy. Claire worked at the Manhattan Historical Preservation Museum, a quiet institution tucked between 2 glass towers in the financial district, where she spent her days restoring documents, letters, and photographs that most people had forgotten existed. She was brilliant at her work in a way that was almost invisible, the kind of brilliant that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't need applause, that simply shows up every day and does what needs to be done. She was also quietly something else entirely. But Ethan didn't know that yet. What Ethan knew, what he was paying attention to, was that his career was accelerating, and the world he was accelerating into had very specific expectations about the kind of woman a man in his position should have beside him. It started small, the way it always does. A comment at a company dinner, maybe 2 years into his promotion. His managing director's wife was a former model turned luxury brand ambassador, and she arrived in a dress that was photographed for 3 different lifestyle blogs. Ethan noticed the way his director looked at her when she entered the room, not with love exactly, with pride, the pride of a man displaying something valuable. Ethan drove home that night in silence. Claire had not come to the dinner. She had a restoration deadline the next morning, a particularly fragile set of Revolutionary War correspondence that required careful attention, and she had apologized sincerely and meant it completely. Ethan had said he understood, but sitting in the car in the parking garage, he found himself remembering the way his director had looked at his wife, and he found himself doing math that had nothing to do with quarterly returns. He told himself it was nothing, but the score in his head had shifted. Over the next 18 months, Ethan began changing in ways so gradual that Claire didn't immediately recognize the pattern. He started suggesting she dress differently for work events. Not rudely, never rudely, not yet, but with a kind of careful phrasing that always left Claire wondering whether she had misunderstood him. He would say things like, "You could wear that blue dress, the one from the holidays," on evenings when she had already selected a perfectly appropriate outfit. Or he would glance at her work shoes, practical, comfortable, worn from long days on museum floors, and say nothing, but the silence would carry a weight that words hadn't earned yet. Claire noticed. She was too intelligent not to notice. But she loved him. And love, when it lives alongside hope, has a remarkable capacity for patience. She adjusted small things. She bought new dresses. She attended more dinners. She smiled at the right people and said the right things, and she was good at it, better than Ethan ever acknowledged, because Claire Whitmore was a woman who had grown up around people of considerable influence and had simply chosen a different path for herself. That choice, as it turned out, was something Ethan would never forgive her for. The turning point came at the Harrington Investment Summit, a black tie event held annually at a hotel in Midtown that Ethan had been trying to attend for 3 years. That year he finally had an invitation. I was thrilled. He had talked about it for weeks. Claire wore a simple navy dress, classic, elegant, not flashy. Ethan looked at her before they left the apartment, and something in his expression shifted. "Is that what you're wearing?" he asked. "Is something wrong with it?" "No," he said. "It's fine." The word fine landed like a stone dropped in still water. At the event, Ethan worked the room with the energy of a man who had been preparing for this exact night his entire career. He was charming, confident, strategically positioned at every important conversation. Claire stayed nearby, quiet and composed, genuinely interested in the people she met, asking questions that made people feel seen. But Ethan was watching other couples. He watched the way certain women commanded attention simply by existing in a room, the way they laughed in a way that made cameras turn, the way their husbands stood slightly taller when standing beside them, and he watched Claire in her simple navy dress speaking thoughtfully to an older woman near the window, and something cold settled into the center of his chest. He told himself what he was feeling was embarrassment. He would not admit, not for years, that what he actually felt was shame, not of Claire, but of himself. Of the part of himself that had looked at a remarkable woman and seen only what she wasn't. He met Sabrina Vale 6 weeks after the Harrington Summit. She came into his world the way a lit match comes into contact with dry paper, sudden, bright, consuming, and impossible to contain once it starts. Sabrina was 29 years old, a social media personality with 4 million followers across 3 platforms, known for her luxury travel content, her designer wardrobe, and a smile that had been described in at least one magazine profile as aggressively aspirational. She was beautiful in the way that certain things are beautiful immediately, obviously in a way that requires no context or explanation. She was also, as Ethan would eventually discover, entirely hollow at the center. But he didn't see that yet. What he saw was everything his internal scorecard had been searching for. He saw a woman who walked into rooms and made them stop. He saw someone who understood the language of image and status and attention in a way that Claire, deliberately, thoughtfully, by choice, had always refused to speak. He saw, in other words, a reflection of what he had convinced himself he deserved. The affair lasted 4 months before Ethan stopped lying about it. He came home on a Thursday evening in October, removed his coat, poured himself a glass of water, and sat down at the kitchen table across from Claire. She was reading. A book about the preservation of antebellum documents, dog-eared and annotated in the margins in her small, precise handwriting. She looked up, and she knew, not because he said anything yet, but because Claire Whitmore had always been able to read people with the same care and precision she applied to fragile, irreplaceable things. "You should just say it," she said quietly. "Claire, Ethan, say it." He did. He told her about Sabrina. He used the words he had rehearsed, the ones that were designed to make this someone else's fault, the product of circumstances, rather than choices. He talked about feeling disconnected. He talked about wanting different things. He talked about needing someone who matched his ambition, as though ambition were a quality Claire lacked, rather than a quality she had simply chosen to apply differently. Claire listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You didn't leave because life got difficult," she said. "You left because you decided I wasn't valuable enough to stay for." "That's not—" "It is." Her voice was calm, not cold calm. "There is a profound difference. And that's your right. People leave, but don't dress it up as anything other than what it is." Ethan reached into his jacket and placed a check on the table. He had calculated what he believed was a generous settlement, a number that in his mind balanced the equation. He had convinced himself that money could close this chapter cleanly, the way a contract closes a deal. Claire looked at the check. She looked at him. "You think this is what the last decade was worth?" "I think it's fair." "I'm sure you do." She slid the check back across the table without picking it up. "Keep it. I don't want it." Ethan frowned. This was not the reaction he had prepared for. "Claire, be reasonable. This is a significant amount." "Ethan." She stood up. She was not tall, but she stood in a way that seemed to occupy the full height of the room. "One day you will understand the difference between someone who loves your success and someone who helped build it. I genuinely hope that day comes before it's too late." He laughed. Not meanly, or at least he told himself it wasn't mean. He laughed with the specific lightness of a man who has already closed a door in his mind and simply hasn't closed it with his body yet. "I'll be fine," he said. "I know you will," she said. "I've made sure of it." He didn't know what she meant by that. He didn't ask. He left the apartment that night with a suitcase and the absolute certainty that he had made the right decision, that the best years of his life were still ahead of him, that the woman he was leaving behind was simply too small for the future he was building. He was wrong about almost everything. But he wouldn't find out how wrong for another 3 years. In the weeks after the divorce was finalized, Ethan Caldwell threw himself into his new life with the energy of a man running towards something, though if anyone had looked closely enough, they might have noticed it looked more like running away. He and Sabrina appeared together at industry events, at gallery openings, at the kind of private dinners where the invitation alone was considered a status symbol. She posted photographs of them, constantly beautiful, curated images with filters that made everything look warmer and more golden than it actually was. The response from Ethan's professional circle was not quite what he had expected. People were polite, they always were. But there was a subtle shift in certain rooms, a slight recalibration of how people positioned themselves in conversations with him. Some of the older partners at the firm, men and women who had respected Ethan's steady rise and his reliable judgment, became cooler in their manner. Not openly, nothing so obvious, just cooler. Ethan attributed it to jealousy. I was wrong about that too. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, because the architecture of it had been built so carefully and so quietly, was that Claire Whitmore had not simply left their marriage and walked away into ordinary life. She had walked into something else entirely. For years, even during their marriage, Claire had been managing a responsibility she had deliberately kept separate from their shared life. Her family, the Whitmore family, one of the oldest private wealth families on the eastern seaboard, had entrusted her with the stewardship of a foundation and investment group that had been built over 4 generations. She hadn't told Ethan, not because she was ashamed of it, not because she wanted to deceive him, but because she had wanted more than almost anything in her life to be loved by someone who saw her not the name, not the legacy, not the doors that opened when certain people heard her family's history, just her. And for a time in those early years in the small Brooklyn apartment, in those late evenings when they talked about history and fragility and the weight of things that needed protecting, she had believed Ethan was that person. She had been wrong too. But where Ethan's mistake had been a failure of character, Claire's had simply been a failure of faith. And that, as it turned out, was something she could correct. After the divorce, Claire stepped fully into her role at the Whitmore Heritage Foundation. Within 18 months, she had restructured 2 major endowments, launched a preservation initiative that partnered with 4 state governments, and quietly began using the foundation's considerable investment arm to fund projects that her advisors described as visionary, and that her critics, the ones who didn't understand yet, described as baffling. She also slowly and without announcement withdrew the anonymous protection that had been quietly extended to Ethan's firm during a particularly vulnerable period 2 years into their marriage, when an undisclosed liquidity problem had threatened to unravel everything Ethan believed he had built on his own. The support had come through 3 intermediary funds. Ethan had never known it existed. Its absence was felt in ways he could not entirely explain. Projects that should have closed easily began stalling. Relationships that had seemed solid began developing subtle fractures. The momentum he had counted on, the invisible current that had been carrying him forward, became unreliable in a way that kept him up at night. He hired 2 consultants to try to identify the problem. Neither of them could find it, because you cannot identify the absence of something you never knew was there. And then, on a Thursday morning in early spring, 3 years after the divorce, Ethan's assistant placed an envelope on his desk. Heavy cream paper, wax seal, no return address beyond a small embossed symbol, a crown intertwined with what appeared to be an open book. He opened it slowly with the particular attention of a man who recognized that certain communications require a different kind of receiving. Inside was a single card, engraved formal, an invitation to the American Heritage Charity Gala, to be held at the Whitmore Estate in Virginia, hosted by Her Majesty Queen Claire Whitmore of the American Heritage Crown Foundation. Ethan sat at his desk for a long time after reading the card. He read the name again, then again, Queen Claire Whitmore. He told himself it was a coincidence, a different Claire Whitmore, an unusual but not impossible overlap of names. He told himself the woman he had been married to was a museum archivist who wore comfortable shoes and read books about antebellum documents in the evenings. He told himself a lot of things, but his hands were not entirely steady when he set the invitation back down on his desk. He called his most connected colleague, a man named Richard Hargrove, who had attended every significant event in the city for 30 years and who knew with encyclopedic precision who everyone of consequence was. "Richard," he said, "I received an invitation today, the American Heritage Charity Gala. Do you know it?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Ethan." Richard's voice had a quality he couldn't immediately name. "Where did you get that invitation?" "It arrived at the office." Another pause. "That event," Richard said carefully, "is one of the most exclusive gatherings in the country. The host controls more charitable and investment influence than most people in this city will encounter in their entire careers. If you received an invitation, someone wants you there for a reason." "What about the host?" Ethan asked. "Claire Whitmore. Do you know—" "Everyone knows Claire Whitmore," Richard said, and now Ethan could name the quality in his voice. It was respect, the kind that doesn't need to be explained because it is too fundamental to require decoration. "If you've met her, Ethan, you'd remember it." Ethan's throat tightened. "I may have," he said quietly. He did not explain further. He spent the rest of the week preparing for the gala with a meticulous attention to detail that he told himself was professional, and that was actually something closer to fear dressed up in expensive clothing. He booked Sabrina a designer gown. He ordered his own custom tuxedo. He researched the guest list with the focus of a man preparing for battle. And on the evening of the gala, as the car carried them through the wrought iron gates of the Whitmore Estate in Virginia, and up a long avenue lined with old oaks whose branches arched overhead like cathedral vaulting, Ethan Caldwell looked out the window and felt the first real tremor of something he was not prepared to name. Sabrina was filming everything. "This is unbelievable," she breathed, pressing the camera closer to the glass. "My followers are going to completely lose their minds." Ethan said nothing. He was looking at the house. Not a house, an estate. A building that had stood for over 200 years, whose stone walls had absorbed the weight of American history in ways that no single generation could fully comprehend. The kind of place that does not announce its importance because it has never needed to. The kind of place that reminded you very quietly that some things had been here long before you arrived and would be here long after you were gone. They stepped out of the car. Ethan straightened his jacket. Sabrina tilted her chin toward her own phone camera and smiled, and they walked toward the entrance of the most important evening of Ethan Caldwell's life, though not in any way he had anticipated. The ballroom was filled with people whose names had weight: senators, federal judges, old money philanthropists whose families had endowed universities and hospitals, and whose influence was so deeply woven into the fabric of American institutions that removing it would have been like pulling load-bearing thread. There were technology founders whose companies had reshaped entire industries, and there were artists and historians and doctors who had done work that would outlast every dollar in the room. Ethan recognized many of them. He introduced himself confidently. He shook hands. He delivered the version of himself that he had spent years crafting, polished, impressive, assured. And he noticed with growing confusion that something was off. People were pleasant. They accepted his handshake. They smiled at the appropriate moments. But there was a quality to their engagement, a slight withholding, as though everyone in the room knew something that Ethan did not, and was choosing out of some collective understanding to wait. He could feel it. He couldn't name it. And not being able to name it made him more uncomfortable than any outright rejection would have. Sabrina, who was either unaware of or simply immune to subtlety, moved through the room with tremendous confidence, filming everything, grabbing canapes from passing trays, laughing at her own observations. More than once, Ethan caught people watching her with expressions that were not unkind, but were profoundly clear. She was lovely. She was absolutely and entirely out of place. And then at precisely 9 o'clock, the music stopped. Not faded, stopped. The sudden silence had a physical quality, like the pressure change before a storm. Every head in the room turned toward the grand staircase at the far end of the ballroom. The massive doors at the top of the stairs opened, and she came down. She wore midnight blue, no excessive jewelry, no extravagant display, just a woman descending a staircase with the kind of absolute unperformed authority that cannot be purchased or rehearsed, that exists only when a person has spent years becoming precisely who they are meant to be. The announcer's voice filled the room. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the founder and chair of the American Heritage Crown Foundation, Her Majesty Queen Claire Whitmore. The applause began immediately, and it was not the polite, structured applause of obligation. It was the kind of applause that rises from genuine feeling, from recognition, from the particular warmth that people reserve for someone they truly believe in. Ethan Caldwell did not applaud. He stood completely still, his glass suspended halfway between the table and his lips, his lungs locked around a breath he had forgotten to release. Because the woman walking down that staircase, the woman receiving that applause, the woman who owned this estate and this evening, and apparently a significant portion of the institutional respect in this room, was Claire. His Claire. The woman he had handed a settlement check to on a kitchen table 3 years ago. The woman he had walked away from with a suitcase and an absolute conviction that he was making the right choice. The woman he had laughed at. The glass nearly slipped from his hand. Beside him, Sabrina leaned close, her eyes wide and genuinely curious. "Who is that?" she whispered. "She's incredible." Ethan opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "That's," he started. He stopped, because there was no version of the next sentence that didn't fundamentally rewrite every story he had been telling himself for 3 years. "Ethan," Sabrina frowned at him. "Are you okay? You look like you're going to pass out." "That's my ex-wife," he said. Sabrina stared at him. Then she laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "That is not your ex-wife." "It is." "The museum lady," Sabrina said. "The one who—" "Yes." Sabrina looked at the staircase again, looked at Claire, who was now moving through the room with the grace of someone who belongs in every space they enter, stopping to embrace people, leaning in to hear what they said, responding with a warmth that was completely genuine and entirely unperformed. Then Sabrina looked back at Ethan, and for the first time since he had met her, Ethan saw something in Sabrina's expression that was not curated, not filtered, not calculated for an audience. She was looking at him the way you look at someone when you've just understood something you should have seen a long time ago. "Ethan," she said quietly, "what did you do?" He had no answer. Because standing in that ballroom, watching the room orbit around Claire Whitmore with the naturalness of something that had always been true. Ethan Caldwell felt the first real crack appear in the wall of certainty he had been building and living inside for years. He had believed he was winning. He had been wrong about what the game even was. And the woman who had tried in her quiet and irreversible way to tell him so, the woman he had laughed at on his way out the door, was standing at the center of the room he had spent 3 years trying to enter, smiling at the people she had built a life worth living, and she had not yet looked in his direction. He almost hoped she wouldn't. But part of him, the part that still remembered Brooklyn, the small apartment, the late evenings about history and fragility, and the weight of things that need protecting, knew that she already knew he was there. She had always known exactly what was in the room with her. He was beginning to understand precisely the point. Ethan did not move for a full 30 seconds. He stood in the middle of that ballroom with 500 people around him, the sound of applause filling every corner of the room, and he could not move a single muscle in his body. His glass was still raised halfway to his lips. His chest had stopped working the way chests are supposed to work, and his eyes were locked on the woman descending that staircase with the kind of calm authority that made the entire room feel smaller, simply by contrast. Claire, not a different Claire Whitmore, not a coincidence, not some elaborate misunderstanding that would resolve itself in the next 60 seconds. Claire, his Claire, the woman who had read annotated books at the kitchen table in comfortable shoes and never once asked him to notice her. She reached the bottom of the staircase and the applause did not diminish. If anything, it grew. People moved toward her with the specific energy of individuals who are genuinely glad. Someone exists in the world, not the performed enthusiasm of networking, not the calculated warmth of people who want something, but the real thing, the kind of welcome you cannot manufacture. Ethan had spent 15 years in rooms full of powerful people. He knew the difference. Beside him, Sabrina had gone quiet for the first time all evening. That alone told him everything. Sabrina Vale did not go quiet. Sabrina filled silence the way water fills a vessel, automatically, completely, without any apparent awareness that silence had existed before she arrived. Her commentary was constant. Her observations, her reactions, her running monologue delivered partly to him and partly to the invisible audience of followers she carried with her. Everywhere. It was the background noise of his life for 3 years, so consistent that its absence registered in his body before his mind caught up. She was quiet. She was watching Claire move through that room, and the expression on Sabrina's face, unguarded, unfiltered, stripped of the particular performance that was her default mode of existing in public, was something Ethan had never seen on her before. It was awe. "She's not what I expected," Sabrina said finally. Her voice was different, quieter, like she was thinking out loud and had forgotten he was there. "What did you expect?" Ethan asked, and his voice came out wrong. Too tight, too careful. Sabrina turned to look at him. "I expected someone older, someone who looked like old money is supposed to look. You know, stiff, cold." She looked back at Claire. "She looks like she actually belongs here, like this is just Tuesday for her." Ethan said nothing, because that was exactly it. That was the thing about Claire that he had spent years misinterpreting as ordinariness. She had never needed to perform comfort in any room because she had never felt out of place in any room. He had read that as a lack of ambition. He had read her stillness as smallness. He had been reading the wrong language the entire time. A man appeared at Ethan's elbow, mid-60s, silver-haired. The kind of face that belongs to someone who has sat at consequential tables for decades and has stopped being impressed by anything except genuine substance. "Ethan Caldwell," the man said. Ethan turned. "Yes, I'm Walter Ashford. I believe we've spoken by phone." Walter extended his hand. His grip was firm and brief, the handshake of a man who has taken the measure of the person across from him and already moved on to the next calculation. "I have to say I was surprised to see your name on the guest list tonight." "Surprised?" Ethan managed to smile. "I hope pleasantly." Walter Ashford's expression was unreadable. "That remains to be seen." He tilted his head slightly toward the center of the room, toward Claire, who was currently leaning in to hear something an elderly woman was telling her, one hand resting gently on the woman's arm. "You know our host, I understand." It was not a question. "We've met," Ethan said carefully. "Yes," Walter said. "I imagine you have." He picked up a glass from a passing tray. "She's extraordinary, isn't she? The work she's done with the foundation in the last 3 years alone has been remarkable, the kind of leadership you don't see often." He took a slow sip. "The kind of person you don't appreciate until they're gone, some might say." The words were entirely neutral. They landed like a closed fist. "If you'll excuse me," Walter said pleasantly, and moved away without waiting for a response. Ethan stood there. Sabrina was looking at him. "What was that about?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "Networking." But his jaw was tight, and Sabrina, whatever her limitations, was not unobservant. "Ethan." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "People keep looking at you weird. I've been noticing it all night. Not at me, I'm used to people looking at me. At you, like they know something. You're imagining it." I'm really not." She looked around the room briefly, then back at him. "Did something happen before tonight, I mean? With these people? Did you do something? Can we not do this here? I'm just asking." "Sabrina," his voice was sharper than he intended. Several nearby guests glanced over. He lowered it. "I said not here." She pressed her lips together, picked up her champagne, said nothing. But her eyes followed Claire for the rest of the evening with an attention that she was not even trying to disguise. The dinner was seated. Ethan found his place card at a table near the center of the room, close enough to the main table that it would have felt like an honor under any other circumstances. The people around him were significant. A federal appeals court judge, the CEO of a healthcare foundation, a woman who had served 2 terms in the Senate. Under normal circumstances, Ethan would have been working this table with everything he had. Instead, he kept his eyes on the main table. Claire sat at the center of it. To her right was a man Ethan vaguely recognized as the Secretary of the Interior. To her left was a woman who had founded one of the largest private equity firms in the Southeast. Claire was talking to both of them, easily moving between conversations with the fluid naturalness of someone who has never in their life found conversation difficult, who has in fact found it one of the genuine pleasures of being alive. The judge beside Ethan introduced himself. Ethan shook his hand. "First time at the Whitmore Gala?" the judge asked. "It is," Ethan said. "Remarkable event. I've been coming for 6 years, since Claire took over the foundation." The judge shook his head slightly with the specific admiration of someone who has watched something develop over time and is still not entirely used to how impressive it has become. "She transformed it. The endowment alone has tripled. But it's not even the money, it's what she does with it. The projects she chooses, the way she thinks about impact." He glanced toward the main table. "Not many people have that combination, the vision and the heart." "No," Ethan said. "Not many." His voice was steady. His hands beneath the table were not. The dinner progressed. 3 courses, each one accompanied by conversation that Ethan was physically present for and mentally absent from, because the majority of his processing capacity was occupied by a single relentless question that he could not silence. How had he not known? It was the question underneath all the other questions, the one that made him feel the most unsteady, because the answer, the real answer, not the one he wanted, was that he had known. Not the specifics, not the foundation, not the investment group, not the full scope of what the Whitmore name meant in rooms like this one. But he had known that Claire was more than what she showed. He had known it in the particular way she carried herself, in the steadiness of her judgment, in the way people with genuine substance responded to her when they were in the same room. He had known, and he had misread it as restraint, as limitation, as someone who lacked the hunger to become something larger. He had been so wrong about the hunger. She had simply been hungry for things he had not learned to value. The dessert course arrived, and then Claire stood. The room came to attention without being asked. Not with any signal, not with a bell or a gesture from a coordinator. Simply because when Claire Whitmore stood and prepared to speak, the room understood instinctively that listening was the appropriate response. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was warm and clear, and it carried without effort. "Thank you for being here tonight, not just for what your presence represents in terms of support for this foundation's work, though that matters enormously, but for what it says about who you are as individuals. The people in this room have each in your own ways chosen to use what you have in service of something larger than yourselves. That choice is not easy, and it is never finished. It has to be made again and again, often in moments when it would be considerably more convenient to make a different choice entirely." She paused. "Let that settle. I want to talk tonight about something that our foundation is launching, a new initiative called the Second Foundation Project. It is designed for people who have lost everything, not through failure of character, but through circumstances, through the choices of others, through the specific and often invisible ways that our society fails the people who are quietly holding it together." Her voice did not waver. "These are people who built things, who supported things, who were essential to structures that others took credit for and later abandoned, and who were left when that abandonment came with nothing but the knowledge of what they had contributed and no way to prove it." The room was entirely still. Ethan's fork was resting on the edge of his plate. He had set it down without realizing. The second foundation project, Claire continued, will provide resources, mentorship, and advocacy for these individuals. It will help them rebuild not just their financial stability, but their sense of their own value. Because the cruelest thing that can happen to a person who has given everything is to be made to feel that what they gave was worth nothing. She looked out at the room. For just a moment, a fraction of a second, a beat so small that Ethan would spend weeks afterward wondering whether he had imagined it, her eyes moved to where he was sitting. Then they moved on, but his lungs had stopped again. The applause that followed was immediate and sustained. The federal judge beside Ethan was clapping with genuine feeling. The senator across the table had her hand pressed briefly to her chest. Even Sabrina, who had not appeared deeply engaged with the philanthropic dimension of the evening, was clapping with an expression that was unexpectedly sincere. Ethan clapped. His hands moved through the motion automatically, while his mind was somewhere else entirely, back in a kitchen in Manhattan, watching a check slide back across a table toward him, hearing a voice say something he had dismissed so completely that it had taken 3 years and this exact evening to fully understand what the words had meant. "I've made sure of it." That was what Claire had said the night he left. He had assumed it was a reference to herself, that she had made sure she would be fine. He had taken it as a kind of dignified exit line, the last bit of composure from a woman who was holding herself together in a difficult moment. He understood now that it had meant something entirely different. She had made sure of him. She had been making sure of him for years through channels he had never seen and protections he had never known existed, and when he left, she had stopped. Not out of spite, not out of revenge, simply because the arrangement had required on some fundamental level that they be in it together. And they were no longer in it together. The momentum he thought he had built on his own, the invisible current he thought was his talent, his drive, his edge. I thought about every deal that had stalled in the last 3 years, every relationship that had cooled without explanation, every project that had moved more slowly than it should have, that had required more effort than he expected, that had left him lying awake, calculating what had changed, and finding no satisfactory answer. His chest felt hollow. Not with grief, not yet. With something more immediate, the particular dizziness of a person who has just realized the floor they were standing on was not the floor they thought it was. After dinner, the event moved into a reception format. Music resumed. Guests circulated. The energy of the room shifted into something warmer, less formal, the relief of a successful evening settling over everyone like a change in weather. Ethan stood at the edge of the room and watched. Sabrina came to stand beside him. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she said very quietly, "You should go talk to her." Ethan looked at her. "What?" "Claire." Sabrina was looking at the far side of the room where Claire was in conversation with a small group of guests. "You should go talk to her." "Sabrina." "I'm not being noble about it." Her voice was flat and honest in a way he almost never heard from her. "I'm being practical. Whatever happened between you two, whatever you did, it's in this room. Everyone here knows it, and we're the only ones pretending they don't." She turned to look at him directly. "I've been posting all night, and my comments are—" She stopped, looked at her phone, put it face down. "People know who you are, Ethan. They know who she is, and they know you're here." Ethan said nothing. "I'm going to get some air," Sabrina said. She picked up her clutch. She walked away without looking back. And Ethan stood alone in the middle of the room, surrounded by 500 people, and felt more profoundly isolated than he had at any point in his adult life. He thought about leaving. He could get his coat. He could call the car. He could be on the highway back to New York within the hour, and he could spend the rest of his life carefully not thinking about this evening. He almost did it. He was actually calculating the fastest route to the coat check when he heard a voice directly behind him. "I wondered if you'd come find me," the voice said. "Or if you'd leave." He turned around. Claire was standing 2 feet away from him. Up close after 3 years, she was different in ways he hadn't expected. Not older exactly, more settled, like a photograph that had been slightly out of focus and someone had adjusted the lens. She was looking at him with an expression he could not entirely read, not cold, not warm, not triumphant, not wounded. Something more complex than any of those. The expression of someone who has had a very long time to prepare for a moment and has decided in that preparation to be honest rather than theatrical. "Claire," he said. His voice came out rough at the edges. "Ethan," she said, "just his name. The way you say a word you've said so many times, it has lost its edges." "I didn't know," he said. And even as he said it, he knew how inadequate it was. 3 words to cover 3 years and 12 years before that, and everything in between. "I know you didn't," she said. "I mean about the foundation, about all of this. I didn't—" "Ethan," she said it gently, firmly, the way you stop someone from walking further down a road that isn't going to take them anywhere useful. "You not knowing about the foundation was never the problem." He was quiet. "You didn't know because you stopped looking," she said. "Not at the foundation, at me. You stopped looking at me somewhere around year 4, and you started looking at the version of me you'd decided I was. And no matter what I did after that, you could only see the version." The music was soft from across the room. Somewhere behind him a woman laughed at something. The sounds of the evening continued existing around them, while the air between them held very still. "I was wrong," he said. "Yes," she said. Simply, not harshly, just accurately. "I want to—" He stopped. He had been about to say, explain, but the word felt obscene. What was there to explain that she didn't already know better than he did? "I don't know what I want to say." "That's the most honest thing you've said to me in probably 8 years, Claire said, and there was something in her voice, not quite a smile, but the shape of one faint and complicated. "Come with me for a few minutes. There are things you need to understand, not for my sake." She looked at him steadily. "For yours." She turned and walked toward the far end of the hall, where a set of doors opened into the historic library of the Whitmore estate. Ethan stood still for just a moment. Then he followed her. The library was lined floor to ceiling with books that were old enough to have witnessed things that changed the country. The room smelled of leather and history, and the particular quiet of a place that has absorbed a great deal of human feeling over many years without losing its composure. There was no one else inside. 2 chairs angled toward a fireplace that was not lit. A lamp on a side table casting warm, steady light. Claire sat down in one of the chairs. Ethan sat across from her. For a moment they were simply 2 people in a quiet room, the distance between the chairs, nothing compared to the distance between who they had been and who they had each become. "Tell me something," Claire said. "The Meridian deal, 3 years ago. Do you remember it?" Ethan frowned. "Of course. It almost fell apart in the final stages. We lost 2 anchor investors in the same week. It nearly sank the whole thing." "And then it didn't," Claire said. "We found replacement capital, last minute." He paused. "It was—" He stopped. Something shifted in his understanding, a piece moving into a place that changed the picture. "That capital came through the Whitmore Group," Claire said quietly. "Through 2 intermediary funds, anonymously, because your firm's exposure at that moment would have been catastrophic, and I had spent 6 years believing in what you were building, and I wasn't ready to watch it collapse over a liquidity gap that wasn't your fault." Ethan stared at her. "The Porter acquisition the year before that," she continued. Her voice was steady, informational, like she was reading from a report. Not cruel, precise. "When the regulatory review stalled and you lost your lead partner, someone reached out privately to 3 of the review board's consultants, who were known to our foundation through charitable work, not to interfere, to provide context and documentation that the review team hadn't requested but needed. The review moved forward. Claire. The Harrington Summit," she said. "Your first invitation. That came through Walter Ashford, who is a trustee of this foundation, and who agreed to include you on the list because I asked him to, because you needed that access, and you had no path to it on your own yet." Ethan said nothing. Each item landed in the specific way that truth lands when it has been carried quietly for years by one person and has just been set down in front of another. "I'm not telling you this to diminish what you built," Claire said. "You worked hard. The talent was real. The drive was real." She looked at him directly. "But you were not working alone. You never were. And when you left, you took that certainty with you, the certainty that you had done it by yourself, and I let you take it, because I thought eventually you would figure it out." "Why?" Ethan's voice was raw. "Why did you help me after I—" "Because I had already committed to it," she said. "And because I don't stop believing in people just because they've disappointed me. It took me longer than it should have to learn where the limit of that is." She paused. "I found it. The night I left," he said. "Yes." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and looked at the floor for a moment. The silence stretched between them, and neither of them rushed to fill it. "The last 3 years," he said finally, "things started getting harder. Deals that should have been straightforward, relationships that went cold. I couldn't figure out. I know, she said. I didn't pull anything out from under you, she said carefully. I simply stopped putting things in front of you. There's a difference. What you've had for the last 3 years is what you built on your own. Just you. No buffer, no invisible support. She looked at him steadily. How has it felt? He thought about the sleepless nights, the consultants who found nothing, the constant low-grade anxiety of a man who is working as hard as he ever has and producing less than he expects. Hard, he said honestly. Yes, she said. Building things is hard. Building things alone is harder. She sat back slightly. I want you to understand that. Not because I want you to suffer, but because the lesson only lands if you feel it. Ethan looked at her, and something cracked open in him, not dramatically, not with the theatrical collapse of a man having a movie moment, but in the slow, quiet way that things actually break. The gradual giving way of something that has been under pressure for longer than it should have been. I threw away the check, he said. His voice was quieter than it had been all evening. I know. I threw it away because I thought... He stopped, pressed his hand briefly against his jaw. I thought it was just money. I thought money was what that moment was about. What do you think it was about now? He looked at the woman across from him, the woman who had loved him in an apartment where the kitchen and the living room were the same room, who had believed in him before he had given her any real reason to, who had quietly and visibly been building a net beneath everything he thought he was creating on his own. I think, he said slowly, it was about whether I could see you, whether I had ever learned to see you. He swallowed. And I think the answer was no. The room was quiet. The sounds of the gala continued at the far end of the estate, muffled and warm. Claire did not cry. She did not smile. She looked at him the way she had always looked at things that required careful attention with full, steady presence, like whatever she was looking at deserved to be seen clearly. The second foundation project, Ethan said. The speech tonight, the part about people who built things, who were essential, who were left with nothing but the knowledge of what they contributed. Yes, she said. Were you talking about yourself? I was talking about a lot of people, she said. But yes, among them. He sat with that. What do you want from me, Claire? He said finally. Tonight, coming here, the invitation. What is this? She was quiet for a moment, long enough that he understood she had considered the question carefully before deciding to answer it honestly. I want you to understand, she said at last. Not for my sake I've been fine. I've been more than fine. For yours. She leaned forward slightly. Because you are going to spend the rest of your life building things, Ethan. And I want you to build them with your eyes open. I want you to know what it actually takes. I want you to stop keeping score with the wrong measurements. She looked at him without flinching. Because the man I believed in 12 years ago was worth believing in. And I would hate for him to spend the rest of his life being less than that because he never understood what he threw away. The words hit him in the center of his chest, not like a blow, like a door opening. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I'm sorry, he said. 2 words, entirely insufficient and completely true. Claire looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said, and then she stood. Not dramatically, not dismissively, simply because the conversation had reached its natural end, had arrived at the only place it could honestly arrive, and she was a woman who knew when something was complete. Enjoy the rest of the evening, she said. The Foundation's work is worth understanding. There are people here tonight who are doing remarkable things. She paused at the door. Take notes, Ethan. Pay attention to the right people this time. She walked out. He stayed in the library for a long time after she left. The lamp burned steadily on the side table. The books stood in their shelves holding their centuries of accumulated knowledge, and Ethan Caldwell sat in the chair across from an unlit fireplace and understood perhaps for the first time in his adult life what it actually felt like to have nothing left to prove and nowhere left to run. Outside in the ballroom, Sabrina was standing near the bar. She saw him emerge from the library. She looked at his face. She looked toward the main hall where Claire had returned to the gala and was already in conversation with 3 guests who were clearly grateful for her attention. Sabrina looked back at Ethan, and she said with a directness that surprised him, "She didn't take you back, did she?" "No," he said, "but that wasn't why you went in there." He looked at her. "No," he said again, "it wasn't." Sabrina was quiet for a moment. Then she set down her glass. "I want to go home," she said, not angrily, not dramatically, in the voice of someone who has reached the end of an evening that turned out to be about something very different than they expected when they got dressed. "Okay," Ethan said. They waited for the car in silence. And when it came and they got in, and the gates of the Whitmore estate closed behind them in the rear window, Ethan looked back at the lights of the building until the trees swallowed them. He thought about the check he had thrown away on a kitchen table. He thought about a woman in white gloves turning the pages of a fragile letter in a Brooklyn fundraising hall. He thought about the word she had used that last night, irreplaceable. She hadn't said it about herself. She had said it about the documents she worked with, about the things that needed careful handling that could not be recovered if damaged by carelessness. He had heard it. He had not listened. And sitting in the back of a car moving away from the most clarifying evening of his life, Ethan Caldwell finally understood the difference between those two things and began in the dark and the quiet to reckon with the cost of the gap between them. The drive back to New York took 3 hours and 40 minutes. Ethan knew this because he watched every mile of it on the dashboard display, the numbers ticking down in the dark, giving him something concrete to focus on, while everything else in his mind refused to hold still. Sabrina slept in the seat beside him, her head tilted against the window, her designer gown pooling around her in the back seat like a deflated version of the evening she had imagined for herself. He did not sleep. He sat with his hands folded in his lap and looked at the highway disappearing under the car and tried to organize what had happened into something he could manage, something with edges, something that would hold its shape if he looked at it directly. It wouldn't. Every time he thought he had found a frame for the evening, a way of understanding it that left him with some footing, it shifted. Because the problem with what Claire had told him in that library was not that it was complicated, it was that it was simple, devastatingly, irreversibly simple. He had not been who he thought he was. The success he had carried like a flag, the proof that he had done it, that he had built something real, that he was the kind of man who created things rather than inherited them, had been built on a foundation he hadn't known existed. And now that he knew, he could not unknow it. Every achievement of the last decade had a question mark attached to it that would never fully go away. Not because Claire had undermined him. She hadn't. She had supported him the way the ground supports a building, invisibly, completely, without asking to be acknowledged. But the building had been so proud of standing. He got back to the apartment just past 1 in the morning. Sabrina went straight to the bedroom without speaking. He stood in the kitchen for a long time, not moving, not doing anything particular, just standing in the kitchen of an apartment that cost $12,000 a month and feeling the specific poverty of a man who has just discovered that the richest thing he ever had was something he threw away on purpose. He didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table until the sky outside went from black to gray to the particular pale blue of early morning in Manhattan, and he did something he had not done in years. He thought about Claire. Not strategically, not in terms of what had gone wrong or who was at fault or what could be salvaged or managed. He thought about her the way you think about someone when you finally stop trying to protect yourself from the feeling. I thought about the way she laughed when something genuinely surprised her, a short, unguarded sound, nothing like the performed amusement she deployed at social events when she was being gracious. The real one. The one that arrived before she could decide whether to let it. I thought about the morning she had driven 2 hours to a small archive in Connecticut because she had heard they were considering destroying a collection of letters from a family of freed slaves from the 1870s, and she had spent the entire day photographing every page by hand because the archive couldn't afford digital equipment and she couldn't afford to let the letters disappear. She had come home that evening with aching hands and a kind of quiet satisfaction that needed no audience. He had asked her how it went, and she had said fine, and he had gone back to the report he was reading because fine was not an interesting enough answer to redirect his attention. He pressed his palm flat against the kitchen table and breathed. He had been in the same room as Remarkable for 12 years, and he had kept looking out the window for something more impressive. At 7 in the morning, his phone rang. It was Richard Hargrove. Ethan almost didn't answer. Then he did. "I heard you were at the Whitmore Gala last night," Richard said without preamble. "Word travels fast. Word has been traveling since about 11 o'clock last night, Ethan." Richard's voice was careful, not unkind, but carrying the weight of someone who has information they're not certain how to deliver. People saw you there with Sabrina. People also saw you go into the library with Claire. It was a conversation. I'm sure it was. A pause. I want to give you a piece of advice, and I want you to hear it as coming from someone who has known you for a long time and is not enjoying saying it. Go ahead. The story that is forming in certain circles right now, Richard said, is not flattering. The man who left Claire Whitmore for a social media personality showed up at her event on her home ground with that same woman and then was privately called into a room by the host. It has a shape that people are filling in for themselves, Ethan, and they are not filling it in generously. Ethan said nothing. The Whitmore name carries weight in rooms that matter to your business, Richard continued. Not because anyone will act against you overtly. Claire wouldn't do that. But reputation in this world is not about what people say. It's about who picks up the phone when you call. And right now, some of those people are recalculating. What do you suggest I do? Ethan asked. His voice was flat, not defensive, genuinely asking. Richard was quiet for a moment. I suggest you stop trying to manage the story and start asking yourself what the truth is. Because the truth has a way of being more persuasive than anything you could construct. The call ended. Ethan set the phone down on the table. He heard Sabrina moving in the bedroom. She emerged, 15 minutes later, dressed for comfort rather than performance, her hair pulled back, her face clear of the elaborate makeup from the night before. Without it, she looked younger, more like a person and less like a brand. She went to the coffee machine without speaking, made herself a cup, sat down at the kitchen island across from him. For a moment, they were quiet. I've been thinking, Sabrina said finally, about what? She wrapped both hands around her mug. About last night. She looked at him. I posted 412 photos and videos yesterday, Ethan. 412. And when we got home, I sat in the bathroom and scrolled through the comments, and do you know what the most liked comment on any of my posts from last night was? He waited. It was on a video I took in the ballroom, the one where Claire came down the stairs. She looked at her coffee. The comment said, and I quote, "The woman in the blue gown is carrying the room, and I don't even know who she is yet." She looked up. She had 4,000 shares in 3 hours, from one video I took as background content. Ethan said nothing. I build an audience for a living, Sabrina said. I know what it looks like when someone has real presence, real authority, the kind you can't filter or caption your way into. She was quiet for a moment. She has it. She's had it her whole life, hasn't she? Yes, Ethan said. And you left her? Yes. Sabrina looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were clear and direct, in a way he was not used to seeing from her, or rather in a way he had not been paying attention to, because he had not been paying attention to the right things about her either. She was sharper than he had given her credit for. She just applied it to a world he had dismissed as shallow. I think, she said carefully, that you and I have been useful to each other in ways that have stopped being useful. Ethan looked at her. I needed someone with access, she said. It was blunt and it was honest, and he respected both. Events connections a certain kind of credibility that my platform alone doesn't open. You needed someone who looked the way you thought a successful man's partner should look. She set down her mug. We were a transaction, a good one for a while, but I don't think it's good anymore. No, he said. I don't think it is either. Okay. She nodded once. Okay. She finished her coffee. She went back to the bedroom. She came out 2 hours later with a bag, kissed him once on the cheek, with the warmth of two people who have genuinely understood each other for the first time while saying goodbye, and she left. Ethan sat at the kitchen table and felt the apartment's silence settle around him. It was not peaceful, but it was honest, and honest, he was beginning to understand, was the only material worth building with. 3 days passed. On the 4th day, he went to the office and spent 6 hours doing something he had not done in years. He went through his company's records, not the public records, not the polished quarterly reports, but the raw deal history, the archived correspondence, the paper trail of the last decade. And he looked at it with the specific question Claire had planted in his mind. Where had the help come from? It took him most of the day. He was meticulous about it. He pulled files he hadn't looked at since they were filed cross-referenced dates against the timeline of his marriage, compared the pattern of what had moved easily against the pattern of what had stalled in the years since the divorce. By 6 in the evening, he had a document in front of him that he stared at for a long time without moving. The pattern was undeniable. Not because any single item was conclusive, but because the shape of it, the specific moments where impossible things had become possible, where locked doors had opened without explanation, where capital had arrived from sources that had been vague in documentation and specific in effect, the shape of it matched perfectly against the timeline of Claire's invisible presence in his life. He thought about the night at the Harrington Summit, the first invitation he had ever received to that event. He had been so proud of it, had framed the invitation in his mind as evidence that he had crossed a threshold, that the world had finally recognized what he was worth. Walter Ashford's face from the gala came back to him. The particular expression of a man who knows exactly how a door was opened and is watching the person who walked through it take credit for finding it themselves. Ethan leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He thought about pride, about the specific and lethal form of pride that isn't arrogance exactly. It's more subtle than arrogance. It's the pride that comes from needing desperately to believe that you did it yourself, that you were enough, that no one had to hold the door or carry any part of the weight. He had built his entire identity on that belief, and Claire had known it. She had known it, and she had protected it, and she had never once used what she knew to diminish him, because that was not the kind of person she was. He picked up his phone. He almost called her. He put it back down. Because calling her now with this rawness, this newly opened understanding, felt like the wrong impulse. It felt like the Ethan who kept score, who moved toward things because of what they could give him, who calculated the right moment to make the right move. He did not want to call Claire from that place. He wanted to call her when he had something different to offer, something honest, something that wasn't just the wound talking. He didn't know yet how long that would take. But for the first time in a long time, he was willing to wait for the right thing rather than rushing toward the available thing. He stayed late at the office. When he finally left, he walked home rather than taking a car, something he almost never did, something he hadn't done since the early years when the walk from the subway had been a given rather than a choice. The city moved around him, people carrying groceries, a couple arguing quietly while their dog investigated a corner. A teenager on a bicycle threading through traffic with the specific confidence of someone who has never yet been seriously hurt and doesn't believe they will be. He walked and he thought. I thought about the second foundation project. He thought about Claire's words in that library, the people who built things who were essential, who were left with nothing but the knowledge of what they gave and no way to prove it. He thought about something else too, something that had been sitting in the back of his mind since the gala, waiting for him to be still enough to hear it. During Claire's speech, when she had described the project, she had said something specific. She had said the cruelest thing that can happen to a person who has given everything is to be made to feel that what they gave was worth nothing. He had heard it as being about him, about what he had done to her. But walking home through the city, he realized something. She had also been describing what he had done to himself, because Ethan Caldwell had spent 12 years beside a woman who loved him, who had invested in him, believed in him, quietly built support systems around him, with the patience of someone who understood that real things take time, and he had taken every single piece of that and attributed it to himself. He had erased her contribution so completely that when she left, he genuinely believed nothing essential had changed. He had not only made her feel worthless, he had also made himself unable to see what he actually had. He had impoverished himself. He had thrown away the fortune while keeping the empty vault. It started raining while he was still 6 blocks from home. He didn't run for cover. He walked through it. And by the time he reached his building, soaked through his jacket, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, like a person who had stopped pretending. 2 weeks after the gala, Ethan did something that surprised everyone who knew him. He called a meeting with his entire team, not a strategy session, not a performance review, not the kind of meeting that exists to remind everyone of their position in the hierarchy. He called them in, and he said with the specific discomfort of a man who was doing something for the first time that he had been thinking about how they operated, that he had been thinking about credit and contribution and the way certain kinds of work become invisible when you're focused on the outcome rather than the process. His deputy, a woman named Teresa, who had worked with him for 8 years and had long ago learned to read the exact distance he preferred to keep, looked at him with an expression he had never seen from her before. She looked uncertain, like she was trying to determine whether this was real. "I'm serious," he said, reading the look. "I've been doing this wrong for a long time, and I'm not looking for anyone to agree with me about it. I just want you to know that I know." Teresa said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "You've been doing a lot of it right, Ethan, just not all of it." "Which parts have I been doing wrong?" he asked. She looked at him. He looked back, and she told him. She told him about the analyst whose research had formed the backbone of 3 major deals and who had never once been named in any of the presentations. She told him about the time a junior associate had flagged a structural problem in a contract 6 weeks before it would have become catastrophic, and how the credit for catching it had been absorbed into the team narrative without landing anywhere specific. She told him about the way certain people had stopped bringing their best ideas to him because they had learned that their best ideas became his best ideas once they entered his office. He listened to all of it. He did not defend himself. When she finished, he said, "How long have you been waiting to say that?" 4 years, she said. "I'm sorry it took me this long to be someone you could say it to." She looked at him for a long time. "Are you okay, Ethan? You seem—" She stopped choosing her word. "Different." "I am different," he said. "I don't know if it's the right kind of different yet, but I think it's at least the honest kind." That evening, he came home to an apartment that no longer felt like a showroom. Sabrina had taken most of the decorative elements she had introduced over the years, the particular lamps, the carefully selected throw pillows, the framed photographic prints that were beautiful in a way that required no emotional relationship with the subject. Without them, the apartment revealed itself as the spare, functional space it had always been underneath. He sat on the couch. He looked at his phone. He opened it and found in his contacts the name he had not deleted, Claire W. He stared at it for a long time. Then he opened a new message and typed 3 sentences. He read them back, deleted them, typed them again, read them again, set the phone face down on the cushion beside him. He was not ready. Not because he was afraid of her response, but because he was afraid of his own motives. He needed to be certain as he could be, that reaching out to Claire was not another version of turning to her because he needed something. That it was not him keeping score in a new way, calculating a move that would make him feel better about who he was. He needed to earn the right to say what he wanted to say, and that was going to take longer than 2 weeks. What he didn't know, what he had no way of knowing sitting alone in his stripped-down apartment with his phone face down on the cushion, was that 3 blocks across the city, in an office that occupied the top 2 floors of a building that the Whitmore Foundation had owned for 40 years, Claire was in a meeting that was about to deliver information that changed the shape of the evening entirely. Her chief of staff, a composed and precise man named Marcus, who had been with the foundation for 11 years, placed a folder on the table in front of her. "You need to see this," he said. Claire opened it. Inside was a printout of a financial disclosure, a regulatory filing, a document that on first reading appeared to be routine, but Marcus had not placed routine documents in front of her without summary since his first year. She read it carefully. Then she turned back to the first page and read it again. "When did this come in?" she asked. "This afternoon," Marcus said. "It was filed with the SEC this morning. Someone at the Foundation's legal office flagged it because of the Whitmore Group's historic connection to that particular fund." Claire looked at the document. Then she looked at Marcus. "Does Ethan know about this?" "It involves his firm directly," Marcus said. "He will know. If he doesn't already, he will within 24 hours. Claire closed the folder. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough for Marcus, who had learned over 11 years to read her silences the way a navigator reads weather, to understand that she was not deciding what to think. She had already decided what to think. She was deciding what to do. "There's a problem here," she said. "Yes," Marcus said. "A significant one." "Yes." "And it isn't his fault." Marcus hesitated. "Not directly. No. The exposure is a result of decisions made before the current structure was in place. But he's the one holding the position when the disclosure hits." Claire stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the city. 3 years ago, she said quietly, I stopped protecting him because I believed he needed to understand what it meant to stand on his own. She pressed 2 fingers against the glass. "This is what standing on his own looks like when the ground isn't stable." "What do you want to do?" Marcus asked. "Nothing," she said. Marcus waited. "Not tonight," she added. "Tonight I want you to make sure our legal team is tracking the disclosure and that we understand the full exposure." She turned back from the window. "And tomorrow I want a full briefing, all of it. Because if I'm going to decide what the right thing to do is, I need to know exactly what I'm deciding." Marcus picked up the folder, moved toward the door. "Marcus," Claire said. He stopped. "This stays in this room." "Of course," he said, and left. Claire stood alone in her office for a long time after he went. She thought about the library at the Whitmore estate, about Ethan sitting across from her, hands folded between his knees, looking at the floor with the expression of a man meeting himself clearly for the first time. She thought about what she had said to him, about the second foundation project, about people who had given everything and been left with the knowledge of what they gave and no way to prove it. She had meant every word, but she had not anticipated that the universe would test that meaning quite this quickly, because the document Marcus had placed in front of her revealed something that Ethan didn't know yet, something that would within 24 hours become the most serious professional crisis of his career. And Claire Whitmore, who had every reason in the world to watch it happen, found herself standing at a window in the dark, trying to decide whether helping him again would be wisdom or weakness, whether it would be the choice of someone who had genuinely grown into the leader she had become, or the choice of a woman who, after everything, still loved a man who had thrown her settlement check back across a table and laughed on his way out the door. She thought about something her grandmother had told her once in this very building in the room that was now her office. Her grandmother had said the measure of who you are is not what you do when it costs you nothing. It's what you do when it costs you everything. Claire stood at the window. The city moved below her, indifferent and relentless. She breathed in, she breathed out, and she reached a decision that would cost her something she had been protecting for 3 years. Her anger, because you cannot hold on to anger and also choose to be the person you're trying to be. You have to pick one. She had spent 3 years building something remarkable on the foundation of everything she had learned, including everything she had learned from the marriage that broke. The disappointment had been real, the hurt had been real, and she had transmuted both of them through work and time and deliberate choice into something that helped other people. But there was one last thing she was still holding: the satisfaction of watching Ethan Caldwell stand on his own and discover what that actually meant. She had told herself it was a lesson. And it was. But if she was honest, and Claire Whitmore was above almost everything honest with herself, it had also been something else, something smaller and more human. It had been the knowledge that she knew something he didn't, that she held something he needed, that the power was finally completely and entirely hers. She had not acted on it, she had not used it to harm him, but she had held it quietly in the way that people hold the one warm thing in a cold room, and now she had to decide whether to put it down. She reached for her phone. She did not call Ethan. She called Marcus. "Tomorrow's briefing," she said. "Move it to 7 in the morning and include the options I already know you've been preparing because I know how you work." She could hear the smile in his voice when he said, 7 o'clock, yes. She set the phone down. She sat back in her chair, and she thought about the second foundation project, about the mission statement she had written herself in her own handwriting in the notebook she carried everywhere. For the people who built things they were never given credit for. For the people who held things up that others never knew were falling. For the people who gave everything and were told it was worth nothing. She had written it thinking about others. But sitting alone in her office at 11 at night with a decision in front of her that nobody else would ever fully understand, she read it again and realized it applied to her too. The credit she had never asked for. The contribution that had been invisible by design. The knowledge carried alone for years of what she had quietly held together and what it had cost her. She could let Ethan fall and call it justice, or she could act like the person her foundation was built to defend. She couldn't do both, and Claire Whitmore had never in her life built anything worth having by being less than who she actually was. The SEC disclosure hit Ethan's desk at 7:43 in the morning. I knew it was serious the moment his phone started ringing before he had even made it through his second cup of coffee. The first call was from his firm's legal counsel. The second was from his CFO. The third was from a partner he had not spoken to in 8 months, who opened the conversation with 3 words that made Ethan's stomach drop straight through the floor. "Have you seen it?" He had not seen it yet. He saw it within the next 4 minutes. And by the time he finished reading the document that his assistant had printed and placed on his desk, with the careful, controlled expression of someone who understands that their job in this moment is to deliver information without editorial, Ethan understood why his phone had not stopped vibrating since he walked through the door. The disclosure involved a fund that his firm had used as a vehicle for 2 significant investment rounds 3 years ago, right at the edge of the period when everything had started becoming harder. The fund had a structural problem, not fraud, not criminality, but a compliance failure that had been building for years inside a regulatory framework that had recently tightened in ways nobody had fully anticipated. The exposure was significant. Not catastrophic, but the kind of significant that required immediate coordinated response, and more critically the kind of credibility with the relevant regulatory bodies that Ethan had not spent the last 3 years carefully cultivating. He called an emergency meeting. His entire senior team filed into the conference room within 20 minutes. Teresa was already there when he arrived, her laptop open, 3 documents pulled up side by side, reading with the speed and focus of someone who has already been awake for this problem for longer than the room suspected. "How bad?" Ethan asked, closing the door behind him. "Manageable," Teresa said. "But only if we move fast, and only if we have the right relationships at the regulatory level." She looked at him over the top of her screen. "The problem is that the 2 people who could most directly help us navigate this, Wallace at the SEC and Patricia Chen at the Compliance Advisory Board, neither of them are reachable through our current network in the time frame we need." "What time frame?" 72 hours, said the CFO from the other end of the table. His name was Gordon, and he had the specific pallor of a man who had spent the last hour calculating numbers and not liking any of them. "If we don't get in front of this in 72 hours, the narrative forms without us. And once the narrative forms, I know how narratives work," Ethan said. He stood at the head of the table and looked at the people around him, the people who had shown up, who were here in this room working the problem at 7:50 in the morning because this was their firm too, even if Ethan had not always acted like it was. I thought about what Teresa had told him 2 weeks ago. The analyst whose research had built 3 deals and never heard their name on a stage. The associate who caught the contract problem. The ideas that became his ideas once they crossed the threshold of his office. He thought about all of it, and then he set it aside because the problem in front of him did not wait for the right emotional moment. "Wallace and Patricia Chen," he said. "Who do we know who knows them?" The room offered several names. Each one was tested against the timeline and found wanting for one reason or another. Too peripheral, too slow-moving, too likely to require the kind of favor exchange that itself created new problems. The meeting went around the table twice and came back to the same gap. They were 2 relationships short of managing this the right way. Ethan stood at the head of the table and felt the specific sensation of a man standing on ground that is solid, but not as wide as he thought it was. One more step in the wrong direction, and the edge was right there. He thought about what Claire had said in the library. "What you've had for the last 3 years is what you built on your own. Just you, no buffer." This was what no buffer felt like. He dismissed the team to their work, told them he would have a solution for the relationship gap within 6 hours. He said it with the confidence of a man who has not yet found the solution, but who understands that confidence itself is sometimes the bridge between the problem and the answer. When the room cleared, he sat alone at the conference table for exactly 4 minutes. Then he picked up his phone. He called Richard Hargrove. Richard picked up on the second ring. "I need to ask you something," Ethan said, "and I need you to be straight with me. When have I ever been anything else? Wallace at the SEC and Patricia Chen at the Compliance Board. I need access to both of them within 48 hours. Do you have a path?" There was a pause, the kind that contains calculation rather than uncertainty. "Patricia Chen sits on the advisory board of the Whitmore Foundation," Richard said. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "I know," he said. "And Wallace was at the Whitmore Gala 2 weeks ago, 3rd table from the main. He's known Claire for about 9 years. "I know," Ethan said again. "So you know what I'm about to say. Tell me anyway." "The fastest path to both of those people," Richard said carefully, "runs directly through Claire Whitmore. Not because she owns them, not because she controls them, because she has the kind of authentic relationship with both of them that makes a phone call from her mean something that a phone call from anyone else in your network cannot replicate right now." A pause. "Do you want my honest assessment?" "Always. You have 2 options. You can work around Claire and spend the next 72 hours burning every secondary contact you have and maybe getting partial traction. Or you can make one phone call. Richard stopped. Then, but Ethan, if you call her for this, make sure you know why you're calling, because she will know. She always knows. The call ended. Ethan set the phone down. He sat very still. This was the part he had been afraid of. Not the professional crisis he had navigated those before would navigate them again. What he was afraid of was this specific moment. The moment where reaching out to Claire could look from the outside and from the inside exactly like what he had always done. Turning to her when he needed something, using the connection when it was useful, treating her as a resource rather than a person. I was afraid of becoming in this moment the version of himself that she had finally walked away from. He sat with that fear for a long time, 20 minutes, maybe 30. And then something shifted in him. Not a decision exactly, more like a recognition, a seeing of something that had been right in front of him for weeks. He had been so focused on waiting until he was worthy of reaching out to Claire, until he had cleaned himself up enough, changed enough, earned enough, that he had missed something fundamental. Worthy was not a destination. Worthy was a practice, something you did or didn't do in the actual moments of your actual life, not in the clean, hypothetical space of having already become better. The question was not whether he was ready to be the right person before he called her. The question was whether he could call her as the honest person he was right now, not hiding the need, not packaging it, not making it into something more palatable, and trust that honesty was enough. He picked up his phone. He called her. It rang 3 times. He had time in those 3 rings to reconsider and decide not to. She picked up. "Ethan." Her voice was measured, alert, but not cold. She had been expecting this. He didn't know how he knew that, but he knew it the way you know certain things about people you have been genuinely close to, even after years and distance have changed the shape of everything else. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And I need to tell you 2 things separately. The first thing is why I'm calling. The second thing is something I should have said a long time ago, and that has nothing to do with why I'm calling. And I'm going to separate them very clearly because I don't want you to think one is covering for the other." A beat of silence. "Go ahead," she said. "The second thing first," he said, "because it needs to be said without anything attached to it." He breathed. "I'm sorry, Claire, not for the divorce. That might have been the right thing for both of us, I don't know. But for the way I did it, for the check, for the years before that when I looked at you and decided you weren't impressive enough for the life I thought I deserved." His voice was steady, but it cost him something to keep it that way. "You were the most impressive person in any room I ever shared with you. I just didn't know what impressive actually looked like." The silence that followed was long, not uncomfortable. Long in the way that certain silences are long because they are making room for something that needs space. "Okay," she said, quietly. "Okay," he repeated. "Now the first thing. I have a regulatory problem, a disclosure that landed this morning. I'm not in crisis, but I need 2 relationships I don't have in the time frame I have to work with. Richard told me both of those people know you. I am asking for your help, not because it's convenient, not because I'm calculating the angle, because you're the right person to ask, and I'd rather ask you honestly than pretend I can get there without you." He paused. "And if the answer is no, I understand it completely. I will not use what you told me at the gala as leverage, and I will not make this harder for you than it needs to be." Another silence. When Claire spoke, her voice had shifted slightly. Something in it had loosened. "Patricia and Wallace," she said. "Yes." "I know about the disclosure," she said. "Marcus flagged it 3 days ago." Ethan went still. "You've known for 3 days?" "Yes." "And you didn't—" He stopped himself, because the question he had been about to ask, "and you didn't warn me," was the question of a man who still believed the world owed him a cushion. He stopped it before it became words. "I needed to see what you would do," Claire said. "Not cruelly, honestly. Whether you'd find a way to manage it that didn't involve coming to me, whether you'd come to me for the right reasons or the familiar ones." "Did I pass?" he asked. "You separated the apology from the ask," she said. "Nobody coached you to do that. You did it because you understood why it mattered." A pause. "Yes, you passed." Something in Ethan's chest released, a tension so long-standing he had stopped noticing it as tension and had started experiencing it simply as the baseline pressure of being himself. "What do you need?" Claire asked. "An introduction to Patricia Chen by tomorrow morning, and a word to Wallace that this firm is acting in good faith, which I can document thoroughly, but which will land differently coming from someone he trusts than from my own legal team." "I can do both of those things," Claire said. "I'll call Patricia this afternoon. Wallace, I'll email today and follow up by phone this evening. You'll hear from both of them within 24 hours. "Claire, don't," she said, but not harshly. "Don't thank me in a way that turns this into a transaction. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do, not because you asked nicely, not as a favor you owe me, because this is what the foundation stands for: people who did real work being given a fair chance to stand on it." A beat. "Your work is real, Ethan. It always was. I just needed you to know that it existed inside a larger story than the one you were telling yourself." I was quiet for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask. Why did you invite me to the gala? The real reason, not the foundation's reason, yours." The pause this time was different, more personal, the pause of someone deciding how much truth to carry into the open. "Because I was ready," she said finally. "I had spent 3 years building something I was proud of, and I realized that carrying what I knew about you, the anger, the satisfaction of knowing what I knew, was starting to cost me more than it was worth." Her voice was steady, but he could hear the weight in it. "You can't build a foundation for other people's second chances while privately enjoying watching someone fall. It's a contradiction I wasn't willing to live with anymore." "So you invited me to settle it?" "I invited you to close it," she said. "There's a difference. Settling implies a compromise. I wasn't compromising anything." A pause. "I was just done carrying it." Ethan pressed his hand flat against the conference table, the same gesture he had made in his kitchen 3 weeks ago, reaching for something solid. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think what you've built is extraordinary. Not the money, not the title, the actual thing, the mission, the work, what you said in that speech." He stopped. "I sat in that room and I listened to you, and I thought about all the times I looked right at who you were and decided it wasn't enough. And I want you to know that I understand now that the deficit was mine." Another silence. "That means more than you know," she said. And her voice, for the first time in the entire conversation, carried something personal. Not vulnerable exactly, but present. The way a person sounds when they have stopped performing composure and are simply being composed. "I'll make the calls this afternoon," she said. "Take care of yourself, Ethan." "You too," he said. The call ended. He sat in the conference room alone and breathed. Patricia Chen called him at 4:17 that afternoon. She was brisk, professional, and entirely willing to meet with his legal team the following morning. She did not mention Claire by name. She did not need to. The ease of her availability said everything. Wallace's email arrived at 6:52. 3 sentences, clear, direct, and containing exactly the guidance Ethan's team needed to frame their response in a way that would be received accurately by the regulatory body. The email was followed by a brief phone call at 8 that evening, in which Wallace was collegial in the specific way that people are collegial when someone they respect has told them a person is worth the consideration. By 9 o'clock that evening, Ethan's legal team had what they needed. Teresa sent him a message at 9:15. "How did you get both of them same day?" He typed back a single line. "I asked the right person." She replied with one word: "Good." And that was all. He stayed at the office until 10, not because the work required it, but because he was not ready to go back to the quiet apartment where the absence of Sabrina's constant noise had become a presence of its own, where the stripped walls and the cleared surfaces gave him nowhere to rest his eyes that didn't invite him to think. He sat at his desk, and he did something he had not done in years. He wrote. Not a report, not a strategy document, a letter, handwritten on a legal pad, the kind of writing that has no audience and no objective except to be true. He wrote about the apartment in Brooklyn, the fundraiser, the way Claire had been crouched behind that table with her white-gloved hands on a century-old letter, completely absorbed entirely herself. He wrote about what he had thought when he saw her, not what he had told himself later that he thought the romantic narrative he had constructed over the years, where he had recognized something exceptional and been drawn to it. The actual thought unedited as he remembered it standing there with a drink halfway to his lips. He had thought, here is someone who has no idea she's interesting. And he had been so wrong about that. She had known exactly how interesting she was. She had simply declined to perform it for an audience. He had spent 12 years interpreting her refusal to perform as evidence that the substance wasn't there. He had watched a woman hold her own in any room she entered, connect genuinely with any person she met, do work that mattered with a quiet consistency that accumulated into something remarkable over time. And he had decided, because none of it came with a spotlight, that it didn't count. He kept writing. He wrote about the night he left, the check, her face when she looked at him and said, "I've made sure of it," and the way he had heard it as a woman composing herself in defeat, rather than what it actually was, a statement of fact from someone who was already 2 steps ahead of the situation. He wrote about the gala, about standing in that ballroom and watching the room orbit around her. He wrote about the library, about the particular feeling of hearing the truth from someone who had every reason to use it as a weapon and had chosen instead to use it as a lesson. He wrote for a long time. When he stopped, the pad had 4 pages of tight handwriting, and it was 11:30 at night. He read it back. Then he folded it and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. Not to send, not to show anyone, because some things need to be written, not to be delivered, but to be known, to make the understanding real, by putting it into words that exist outside of your own head. He turned off the desk lamp. He got his coat. He walked to the elevator and rode it down 34 floors to the lobby. The doorman nodded at him. "Good night, Mr. Caldwell." "Good night, Thomas." He paused. Thomas had been working this lobby for 9 years. Ethan had learned his name about 6 months ago when Teresa had said something that required him to look at the people who had always been there. "How are the kids?" Thomas looked briefly startled, then genuinely pleased. "Good, sir. My youngest made the travel soccer team last weekend." "That's great news. Congratulations." "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell." Ethan walked out into the night. He thought about the 4 pages in his jacket pocket, about the first night in Brooklyn, about white gloves and a fragile letter, about the difference between hearing something and listening to it. He thought about Claire's voice on the phone that afternoon, the way she had said you passed with the quiet authority of someone who has spent a very long time deciding exactly what the standards are and why they matter. He thought about what Richard had said before he made the call. "Make sure you know why you're calling, because she will know. She always knows." He walked home through the city. He did not walk quickly, because this was not a night for efficiency. This was a night for paying attention, for noticing the sounds and the weight of the air and the particular way the city moved around a person at midnight, all the lives proceeding in their parallel tracks, each one containing its own version of what had just been figured out and what had not been figured out yet, what had been lost, and what was still possible. He thought about the second foundation project. He had been thinking about it for weeks, not as something abstract, as something specific, as something he could contribute to in a way that was not a donation, not a check written at arm's length, something that required him to be present, to be accountable to something outside his own career trajectory. He had not said anything to anyone yet. I was waiting to be sure, to be certain it was not another calculated move, another item in the ledger, another way of keeping score with a new set of metrics. But walking home through the night with 4 handwritten pages in his inside pocket, and the memory of Claire's voice saying, "Because it's the right thing to do," he found that the uncertainty was quieter than it had been. Not gone, but quieter. And quiet was where things that were actually true tended to live. He reached his building. I went upstairs. He did not turn on the television. He did not open his laptop. He did not check his phone for the first time in what felt like years. He made himself a simple dinner, ate it at the kitchen table, washed the plate. He stood in the kitchen for a moment in the quiet. Then he went to the window and looked out at the city, at the millions of lights representing millions of lives, each one as complicated and real as his own, each one making its own decisions in the dark about what mattered and what didn't, about who to hold on to and who to release, about the difference between the life you performed and the life you actually lived. He thought about what was left, not in terms of damage control or career rehabilitation or any of the practical architecture of rebuilding, but in terms of the actual question, the one underneath everything. Who did he want to be? Not what did he want to have? Not how did he want to appear? Not what score did he want to reach? Who? He pressed his hand against the glass. He thought about the word Claire had used in the library, the word she had attached to the people the second foundation project was designed to serve. Essential. He had spent his entire adult life trying to become important. He had never once tried to become essential. He understood, standing at the window in his quiet apartment, that those were not the same thing at all. Important meant people noticed you. Essential meant the thing fell apart without you. And the person who had been essential, who had been the quiet structural support that everything else rested on, who had done the invisible necessary work that no one credited and no one named, had been Claire. He had been important, she had been essential, and he had thrown away the essential thing in pursuit of becoming more important. He stood at the window for a long time. Then he walked to his desk. He opened his laptop. He pulled up the website for the American Heritage Crown Foundation. He read the mission statement for the second foundation project. He read it twice. Then he opened a new document and began to write something different. Not a letter this time, a proposal. Specific, detailed, built on the actual knowledge and resources and relationships he had spent 15 years accumulating. Applied this time not to the question of how to become more powerful, but to the question of how to be useful. He wrote for 2 hours. When he finished, he read it back. It was the best work he had done in years, not because it was sophisticated, because it was honest. He saved it. He closed the laptop. He sat back in his chair and thought about a woman in an office 3 blocks away who had made 2 phone calls that afternoon because she had decided that carrying the weight of what she knew was costing her more than it was worth. I thought about what it would mean to reach the place where you are so genuinely committed to who you are that you can afford to be generous even to the people who gave you the best reasons not to be. He thought he understood it in the way you understand a place you haven't been yet, but can see clearly from where you're standing. He thought the distance between here and there was real. But for the first time in a very long time, it felt like a distance he was actually moving across rather than a gap he was managing the appearance of. He turned off the light. He went to bed. And for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, he slept through the night without once waking to run the numbers on who was ahead and who was behind and what the score said about the kind of man he was. The score for one night was silent. And in its silence, something else, something quieter and older and considerably more important, finally had room to breathe. The proposal sat in a folder on Ethan's desktop for 11 days before he did anything with it. Not because he had forgotten it, not because he had lost confidence in it, but because he was applying a discipline he had never once practiced in his professional life, the discipline of waiting until the motive was clean, of not moving until he was certain he was moving for the right reason rather than the familiar one. He read it every morning, sometimes twice. He revised it 4 times, each revision stripping away another layer of language that was trying too hard, that was performing sincerity rather than simply being it. By the 4th draft, it was shorter and plainer and considerably more honest than the first, and that was how he knew it was ready. On the 12th day, he printed it out, put it in an envelope, and addressed it by hand to the American Heritage Crown Foundation. Attention, Marcus Webb, Chief of Staff. He did not send it to Claire directly. That choice was deliberate. He had thought about it for 3 of the 11 days. Sending it to Claire directly would have been the move of a man who wanted her to know he had done the work. Sending it through the Foundation's proper channel was the move of a man who had done the work regardless of whether she noticed. He mailed it at the post office on the corner the old-fashioned way because some things deserve the weight of a physical gesture. Then he went back to work. The regulatory situation resolved itself within the week. Patricia Chen's guidance had been precise and actionable, and Ethan's legal team, once pointed in the right direction, moved with an efficiency that made Ethan quietly proud in the way you are proud of people you have finally learned to actually see. The compliance filing was submitted correctly and on schedule. Wallace confirmed the receipt with a brief professional note. The exposure closed without public event. Ethan gathered his entire team in the conference room the morning after it was resolved. He did not give a speech. He was not a man who gave speeches, and trying to become one now would have been performance rather than communication. He simply stood at the head of the table and said, "We moved fast this week and we moved well. I want to name the people who made that happen." He named them, one by one, specifically. Not in the collective fog of "we did it as a team," but by actual name and actual contribution. Teresa for her analysis on the morning. The disclosure landed Gordon for the timeline he built that gave everyone clarity on what the window actually was. A junior analyst named Priya, who had worked through 2 nights to compile the documentation that Patricia Chen's office needed. He said their names, and he said what they had done, and the room was quiet, in a way that felt different from the usual quiet of a meeting. More alive somehow, like people breathing more fully than they normally did. Priya, who was 26 years old and had been at the firm for 18 months and who had never once had her name said out loud in a room like this one, turned a deep red and looked at the table. "Thank you," she said, very quietly, to the table more than to him. "Thank you," he said back, and meant it entirely. After the meeting, Teresa stopped him in the hallway. "Who are you?" she said, "and what did you do with Ethan Caldwell?" He almost laughed. "Is it that obvious?" "Ethan." She looked at him with the direct, clear-eyed regard of someone who has known a person long enough to track their evolution in real time. "You have never in 8 years said anyone's name out loud in a meeting the way you said those names today. You have never said thank you without it being part of a larger sentence about what you needed next." She paused. "It's a good change. I just want you to know that I see it." He thought about Claire, about what it felt like to be truly seen by someone, about how rarely he had offered that to the people who deserved it most. "I'm working on it," he said. "Keep going," she said, and walked back to her office. 3 weeks after he mailed the proposal, Marcus Webb called. Ethan was in the middle of a call with a client when his assistant appeared in the doorway and held up a piece of paper with the foundation's name written on it. He wrapped up the client call in 4 minutes, which was 3 minutes faster than he would normally have managed, and called Marcus back before his chair had fully settled. "Mr. Caldwell," Marcus said. His voice was cordial and measured in the way of someone who is professionally careful but personally watchful. "We received your proposal." "I hope it was clear," Ethan said. "I revised it several times to make sure it wasn't overbuilt." "It's very clear," Marcus said. "That's actually one of the things I wanted to discuss. The clarity of what you're offering, the specific mentorship structure, the use of your regulatory network to help foundation clients navigate compliance challenges, the pro bono advisory hours. This is not the kind of proposal we normally receive." A brief pause. "Most people who want to engage with the foundation want their name on a building." "I don't need my name on anything," Ethan said. "I know," Marcus said. "That's why I'm calling." The pause that followed had a weight to it. "Ms. Whitmore has reviewed the proposal," Marcus said. "She'd like to meet with you, in person, not a formal foundation meeting, a conversation." Another pause. "She asked me to tell you that she read it 3 times. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "When?" he said. "Thursday, 11 o'clock, at the foundation offices." "I'll be there," Ethan said. He put the phone down. He sat at his desk and pressed both hands flat on the surface and breathed in the way he had learned to breathe over the past several weeks, slowly, deliberately, with the specific intention of staying inside the moment rather than skipping ahead to the next one. She had read it 3 times. He knew what that meant. Not romantically, not as a signal of something personal. He knew it because he had spent 12 years living with a woman who read things 3 times when she was deciding whether they were worth trusting. She had done it with documents, with applications to the Foundation's early grant programs, with letters from people she was trying to understand. 3 times meant she was taking it seriously. 3 times meant she had not dismissed it. He turned back to his work. Thursday came. He arrived at the Foundation offices 8 minutes early and waited in the lobby without checking his phone. He sat in the chair and looked at the framed photographs on the walls, images from the Foundation's projects over the years, historic preservation sites, community rebuilding initiatives, photographs of people whose faces carried the particular expression of individuals who have been helped in a way that restored rather than diminished them. He looked at every one of them. Marcus came to collect him precisely at 11. They shook hands. Marcus was polite and direct and assessed him with the calm efficiency of someone whose job includes knowing what belongs in the room and what doesn't, and who has been doing it long enough to be very good at it. Claire's office was on the top floor. The elevator opened directly into an anteroom and then into a large open space that was full of natural light and books and the kind of organized purposefulness that accumulates in a space where real thinking happens. There was nothing decorative about it that wasn't also functional. There were no photos of Claire with famous people. There were no plaques or awards on display. There were 2 chairs near the window that faced each other across a low table, and on the table there was a folder that Ethan recognized as containing his proposal, and there was Claire. She was standing when he entered. She did not come around from behind the desk. She simply stood and looked at him with the clear, direct attention that was the most consistent thing about her, the quality that had drawn him to her at a Brooklyn fundraiser 20 years ago, and that had never once wavered in all the time since even when everything else between them had. "Ethan," she said. "Claire," he said. They shook hands. It was the handshake of two people who have a complicated history and have chosen by mutual and unspoken agreement to proceed with it honestly rather than pretend it doesn't exist. They sat down. Marcus left. The room was quiet. "I read your proposal," Claire said. "Marcus told me. 3 times. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, the shape of one. "He shouldn't have mentioned that." "I'm glad he did." She looked at him for a moment. Then she opened the folder. "Tell me something you didn't put in here," she said. "Something about why you actually wrote it." He had expected this, or something like it, because Claire had always moved past the surface presentation directly to the thing underneath, and she had not changed that habit simply because 3 years had passed. "I wrote it," he said, "because I spent 15 years in rooms where the only question was, who was winning? And I recently spent several weeks understanding that I had been keeping score in a game that was never actually the real game." He paused. "The real game, the one that actually produces something worth having, is the one your foundation is playing. And I have skills that are relevant to it, not peripheral skills, central ones." He looked at her directly. "And I want to use them for something that matters, not to feel better about what I did wrong, because mattering is better than winning. I know that now. I just learned it later than I should have." Claire looked at him for a long time. She looked at him the way she looked at things she was deciding whether to trust with the full weight of her attention, without any performance of what she was or wasn't feeling, with the patience of someone who has never once confused speed with accuracy. "The compliance advisory component," she said. "You're offering 60 hours of your personal time per quarter, not your team's time, yours." "Yes. That's not nothing, Ethan. That's a material commitment from someone at your level." "It's supposed to be," he said. "If it weren't material, it wouldn't mean anything." "Who knows you're doing this?" she asked. He understood the question immediately. She was not asking for a list. She was asking whether this was private or whether it was something he was planning to announce, whether the proposal was a genuine contribution or a reputational move dressed as one. "My assistant knows I had this meeting," he said. "That's all. I haven't told anyone else. I don't intend to." She closed the folder. She folded her hands on top of it. "I want to accept this proposal," she said, "but I want to be honest with you about what that means, because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve comfort." "Go ahead." "Accepting this does not change what happened between us," she said. "It doesn't open a door. It doesn't mean I'm going to soften my position on things that are decided. What it means is that I believe your offer is genuine, and that the Foundation's clients would benefit from it, and that turning it down because of our personal history would be exactly the kind of decision I built this foundation to argue against." She looked at him steadily. "Can you work within that?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "The people you'll be working with are not Wall Street clients, Ethan. They're people who built restaurants and community organizations and small businesses and lost them through circumstances that were not their fault. They don't have the vocabulary you use every day, and they don't need you to translate everything into financial language. They need someone to sit with them and help them understand the systems that have been confusing them and help them feel like those systems are navigable." She held his gaze. "Can you do that genuinely, not as a version of yourself that you perform for an afternoon?" I thought about Priya turning red in the conference room, about Thomas the doorman and his son's soccer team, about the 4 handwritten pages in his inside jacket pocket that he had never sent to anyone. "I think I'm better at it than I was," he said. "I don't think I'm finished learning how." "That's the right answer," she said. "If you'd told me you were already good at it, I wouldn't have believed you." They spent the next hour going through the proposal in detail. It was a working meeting, specific, productive, the kind of conversation that moves from question to answer to next question without wasted motion. Claire pushed back on 2 elements of the proposed structure and explained exactly why. Ethan listened genuinely and revised his thinking in real time rather than defending his original position. Claire noticed. She didn't comment on it, but she noticed. He could tell because the quality of her engagement shifted slightly, became less testing and more collaborative. The shift was small and it was real. At the end of the hour, Marcus knocked and entered with 2 cups of coffee. "Thank you, Marcus," Claire said. "Of course." He set them down, looked at both of them once with the brief, practiced assessment of someone who can read a room in the time it takes to complete a sentence. Then he left. Claire and Ethan picked up their cups. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said. "You keep asking me that question," she said. "You can always ask." "Are you happy?" he said. "Not I don't mean about us, or about the foundation. I mean in general, in your life." He looked at her. "I spent 12 years next to you, and I never once sat across from you in a quiet room and asked you that question. I want to ask it now." Claire was quiet for a moment. He watched her consider the question honestly, not performance, not deflection, but the actual thinking of someone who takes the question seriously. "Yes," she said. "I am." She set down her cup. "Not because everything went perfectly, not because losing the marriage didn't cost me something real, but because the life I've built on the other side of it is genuinely mine. I made the choices. I did the work. I know what it's built on." She looked at him. "That's a kind of happiness that doesn't depend on anything staying the same. It just requires that you keep being honest with yourself." A pause. "Are you—" The question came back to him simply, without pressure. He thought about it honestly. "I'm working toward it," he said. "I think I've been happier in the last 2 months than I was in the last 3 years. And I think the last 3 years were probably better for me than the 3 years before that, even though they felt harder." He paused. "I think I'm finally paying for things with the right currency." She looked at him. Something passed between them that was not romantic and was not indifferent. It was the particular recognition of 2 people who once knew each other deeply and who are discovering across the distance of years and change and consequence that the knowing is still there. Different in shape, real in a different way, but still there. "Okay," she said. She extended her hand across the table. "Welcome to the foundation, Ethan. Don't make me regret it." He shook her hand. "I won't," he said. He meant it as completely as he had ever meant anything. The first session with second foundation clients was scheduled 6 weeks later. 8 people in a conference room on the 2nd floor of the foundation building. A woman who had lost a catering business to a regulatory penalty she hadn't understood. A man whose family restaurant had been trapped in a lease dispute that had drained him for 2 years. 2 partners who had built a small construction company that was now entangled in a compliance issue with the city that was threatening to close it. Ethan arrived 15 minutes early. He had prepared. Not in the way he prepared for board meetings, not with a performance of authority or a curated presentation of expertise. He had prepared by reading every file, learning every name, understanding every situation in its specific detail, so that when he sat down, he was sitting down with people rather than cases. He had also, the night before, done something that surprised even himself. He had called his mother. His mother, Eleanor Caldwell, was 73 years old and lived in a house in New Jersey that she had occupied for 40 years. She had raised Ethan and his younger sister on a teacher's salary after his father left, and she had never once in his memory described what she did as anything other than what needed to be done. He had not called her enough. He knew this, had known it abstractly for years without allowing the knowledge to become action. He called her at 8:30 in the evening. She picked up on the second ring the way she always did because Eleanor Caldwell treated a ringing phone as a person needing answer and had never learned to screen a call. "Ethan," she said, just his name, with the warmth of someone for whom his name had always meant something. "Hi, Mom." They talked for an hour and 20 minutes. He asked about her garden, about the neighbors, about the book club she'd been attending for 15 years that she described with the specific, affectionate exasperation of someone who loves the people in a thing more than the thing itself. He listened to all of it. Near the end of the call, she said, "You sound different, sweetheart." "Different how?" "Quieter," she said, "like you're actually here." A pause. "You've been somewhere else on the phone for years. I didn't say anything because I didn't think you'd hear it." He pressed his hand to his forehead. "I hear it now," he said. "Good," she said, simply. "Come visit soon." "I will," he said. "I'll drive out next weekend. I'll make the pot roast." "I'd love that." He drove to New Jersey the following Saturday. He stayed for 6 hours. He helped her with the garden. He ate the pot roast. He sat on the back porch with her in the early evening and listened to her talk about his father, which she almost never did, and he did not offer analysis or correction or any of the editorial interventions he would have made in a previous version of himself. He just listened. When he left, she hugged him at the door for a long time. "There you are," she said quietly into his shoulder. He had to work very hard at the drive back not to pull over. The clients in that second foundation session were nervous when he arrived. He had expected this. People who have been failed by systems are understandably cautious about the people those systems send to help them. He sat down at the table without positioning himself at the head of it. He introduced himself by first name only. He said, "I know you don't have any reason to trust that I'm going to be useful to you yet. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to tell me what's happening, and I'm going to listen, and we'll figure out together what I can actually do." The woman who had lost the catering business, her name was Diane, 58 years old, 20 years of work behind her, looked at him from across the table with the specific wariness of someone who has heard confident promises from confident men and paid the price for believing them. "What do you get out of this?" she said, directly, without apology for the directness. He appreciated it completely. "Nothing financial," he said. "I'm volunteering. What I get is the chance to do something useful with what I know. That's it." "Why?" she said. He looked at her. "Because someone recently showed me the difference between building something important and building something that actually helps people," he said. "And I've spent my whole career building the wrong kind." Diane looked at him for a long moment, calculating, testing. The way people look at things they're deciding whether to trust. Then she nodded, slowly, once. "Okay," she said. "Here's what happened." He listened for 2.5 hours. By the end of the session, he had identified 3 specific regulatory pathways that Diane could pursue with the Foundation's legal support, and he had connected the construction company partners with 2 contacts in the city's compliance office who would give them a fair hearing. He had not solved everything. He had not pretended to. But he had made the systems visible in a way that they had not been before, and he had watched something change in the room as the morning progressed, the wariness giving way not to trust exactly, but to the specific relief of people who have been confused and frightened for a long time and have just been given a map. After the session ended, as people were gathering their things, Diane stopped at the door. She looked back at him. "Same time next month," she said. "I'll be here," he said. She nodded. She left. He sat alone in the empty conference room for a moment. He thought about the score, the running tally in his head that had been the background noise of his adult life, who had more, who was ahead, what the numbers said about whether he was winning. It was quieter than it had ever been. Not silent. He suspected it would never be entirely silent. It was too deeply wired, too long, practiced too much, a part of the architecture of who he had been for too many years to simply disappear. But it was quieter, and in the quiet, something else was louder than it had been before. Something he recognized now that he could hear it as having been there all along, underneath the scorekeeping, underneath the performance, underneath the long and elaborate project of becoming important. The actual desire to do something worth doing. He had just spent 30 years covering it up with the wrong ambition. Claire was in the hallway when he came out of the conference room. She was walking quickly in the direction of her office, a folder under one arm, her phone to her ear. She saw him and paused her call briefly, holding up one finger. "Wait a moment." He waited. She finished the call, turned to him. "How was it?" "Good," he said. Then more accurately, "Hard. Good." She looked at him with a slight tilt of her head. "Hard how?" "Diane asked me what I get out of it," he said. "What did you tell her?" "The truth." Claire held his gaze for a moment. "And," she said, "okay." He paused. "That's the best review I've ever gotten." Something crossed Claire's face, brief and real and entirely unguarded. The closest thing he had seen to the Claire from the Brooklyn fundraiser, the one who laughed when something genuinely surprised her. Here and gone in half a second. "Good," she said, quietly. Then she was moving again back to her office, back to the work that was always continuous and never finished, back to the life she had built on the foundation of everything she had learned and everything she had survived. He watched her go. He did not call after her. He did not try to extend the moment, because he understood finally and completely that some things are not meant to be held on to. Some things are meant to be honored by letting them be exactly what they are, no more, no less not reshaped by what you need them to be. Claire was not his second chance. She was the evidence of what was possible when a person stopped pretending and started building honestly. She was the standard. And the question of whether he could reach it was one he would spend the rest of his life answering, not with grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but the way all real things are built, one choice at a time, one honest day after another, one room entered with open eyes instead of a running score. 6 months after the gala, Ethan Caldwell's life looked different in ways that were both large and small. He was still on Wall Street, he was still building things, but the firm's culture was shifting slowly and genuinely in ways that Teresa documented in an email she sent him on a Friday afternoon that said simply, "I notice. Keep going." He was driving to New Jersey once a month. He knew Thomas's kids' names and their sports seasons. He was showing up to foundation sessions without announcement, without fanfare, without anyone outside that conference room knowing he was there. And one afternoon, almost exactly a year after the night, he had stood frozen in a ballroom watching his ex-wife descend a staircase with the composed authority of someone who had always known who she was. He sat in a coffee shop across from a young analyst named Daniel, who reminded him uncomfortably and specifically of himself at 28. Hungry in all the wrong directions, keeping score with desperate intensity, measuring himself against every person in the room and finding a reason to come up short. Daniel was asking him for career advice. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Can I tell you a story first?" Daniel looked uncertain. "Sure." "It's about a mistake I made," Ethan said. "A significant one. And what it cost me. And what I learned from it." He paused. "It's not a comfortable story, but it's the most useful thing I have." Daniel nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. Ethan picked up his coffee, and he told the truth. All of it. Without softening the parts that made him look bad, without repositioning the narrative to make himself the hero at the end, without any of the careful editing that had been his default mode for so many years. He told it honestly. And when he finished, Daniel was quiet for a long time. "What do you wish someone had told you?" he asked, "before all of it?" Ethan thought about it. He thought about a woman in white gloves at a folding table in Brooklyn, about a quiet apartment and a kitchen table and a check sliding back across the surface untouched, about a grand staircase and 500 people who already knew what he was only beginning to understand, about a library and a phone call and a conference room where a woman named Diane said, "Okay," with the specific weight of someone who has decided to try trusting again. He thought about his mother saying, "There you are." He set down his cup. "That the quietest person in any room," he said, "is usually the one holding everything together. And if you are lucky enough to be standing next to that person, if you are lucky enough to have someone that essential in your life, do not spend a single day mistaking their stillness for smallness." He looked at Daniel. "Pay attention to the right things, before it takes you 15 years and the most humbling night of your life to learn the difference." Daniel looked at him. "Did you get her back?" he asked. Ethan smiled, slowly, honestly, with the particular warmth of someone who has finally learned the difference between what they want and what is right. "No," he said, "but I got myself back, and that turned out to be what was actually necessary." He paid for the coffees. He walked back out into the city that had always been moving around him, indifferent and relentless and full of lives that were making their own decisions in the dark about what mattered and what didn't. He did not check his phone. He did not calculate who was ahead. He just walked. And for a man who had spent his entire adult life running, that was